But let's now talk about my true passion, that is T206 polar bears. My purchases can be summed up in really three ways. Routine, I took a gamble on one, and another one I found an absolute ghost. When I as a collector look back at last week's 2024 National Sports Card Convention, what is my one takeaway as a pre-war collector? And then what cards did I pick up during my week in Cleveland? I'll tell you, it wasn't always a polar bear purchase, but they did dominate my purchases from last week. So we'll come back to my one thought here in a second, but it's really going to dictate how I purchase cards going forward, even though I have a complete 250 card polar bear back run set. But first, let's take a look at the three cards I purchased that did not have a polar back on it. First up was my lone raw purchase of the week, and this was my lone T212 purchase for my Seattle team set. I definitely 100% overpaid for this card, but this is one of those situations to where these cards are not always up for sale, and if I pass on them at the National, I may not see them for another year. This is what happened to me last year. I put down two T212 OBAC Seattle team players that I needed for my complete 24 card set. Keeping in mind, I'm only 3 or 4 cards away from completing that team set, and I have not seen those two cards up for sale over the entire calendar year. So when I saw this Thompson pop up, I had to make a deal for it, and this was also from the only vendor that I could find that had OBAC cards in his display case. I paid $130 for it, but this is for the collection and it's for the team set, so I thought it was worth the $130. Now my second non-polar bear purchase was actually my very first purchase of the day on Thursday morning, probably around 9:45, but shout out to Tony at Monster Cards, just an outstanding dealer, outstanding person. I love visiting that table when I'm there at the National. He gave me an incredible deal on my 9th T206 Old Mill Southern League card. This Al Orth card, he charged me just $75 for it, so I thought that was a fantastic way to start out the National, picking up an Old Mill Southern Leaguer for less than $80. And if you're curious, no, that is not a brown back Old Mill. That's the photo that PSA has for that serial number. I just took it from them because I don't have a high definition scanner. When you take a look at it in person, it is definitely a black back. And now my final non-polar bear purchase was the beginning of a brand new back run set I have for my T206 520 set. Yes, I said 520. I have a goal here now of completing the Old Mill Southern League back run set and now a Sovereign 150 back run set. If I complete the 150, the Old Mill Southern League with my polar bear 250, I'm pretty darn close to 520, and from there I'll just find cards to fill in the missing gaps. But I think this would be an incredible 520 set to have, a complete Sov 150, Old Mill SL, and then polar bear. But there's no better card to purchase first for your new back run set than the very first card. Ed Abaticio is now my very first Sov 150. Now you may ask yourself, why am I going with Sov 150? Number one, the slogan's awesome, fit for a king. But number two here, when you take a look at polar bears, they were made in 1910. These Sov 150 cards, these were the very first run of T206. These were made in 1909. So there is not a single pose or a single portrait that is in a Sov 150 back that is also in a polar bear back. And I will tell you, some of the absolute best portraits in the entire T206 set are from that very first printing. Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson. They are just some amazing portraits that I can't wait to add to my collection. But the goal here is very simple with this Sov 150. I want an SGC 1 and below set, ideally a 1. And now for reference here, there are some SOV 150s when you look at the SGC population report that do not exist in a grade 1. There are some obviously at 1.5. So if I find an A grade, if the back is very clean, I will absolutely pick it up. But from a time frame perspective, I would argue that I'll probably be all gray 10, 15 years before I actually complete this SOV 150 back run set. And I'm also going to be following my own advice. Hall of Famers first, and then pick up the common players. But I just didn't want to miss passing up the very first card for this SOV 150 set, even though Abaticio is not a Hall of Famer. And now this brings me to my real big takeaway from the National as a pre-war collector. When I think back to 5 years ago, you could find a couple of things really in not every showcase, but when you think about vintage or vintage/pre-war cases, you can find raw cards, you can find raw off-backs, and you can of course find the high-grade Hall of Famers. But as I looked at a lot of cases this week, one thing became very, very clear. That mid-grade, I'm talking like grade 2, grade 3, off-back material, Polar Bear, SOV 150s, they're literally drying up. They are going away. You can find raw Piedmonts, raw Sweet Caps, really at any table. Those are so prevalent, they're never really ever going to disappear. But when you take a look at some of the Polar Bears 2s and 3s, I had to hunt and hunt to pick up 8 Polar Bears for the week, and 3 of them I found from one single dealer, so that was very nice. And the same thing here for raw T206 Polar Bears. 5 years ago, you could find raw Polar Bears all over the place. This past week, I did not find very many, or if I asked the dealer to look through their stack, they would always say, oh, it's already been picked through, it's only Piedmonts, it's only Sweet Caps. So there were occasional Polar Bears here or there, but they were just, when I think back to 5 years ago, they were prevalent, and now they're not out there as much. And so eBay will give you a false sense of maybe what the availability is of these cards, because I didn't think I would find a desert landscape of Polar Bears this past week in Cleveland. And now speaking on eBay here, because of what I experienced last week in Cleveland, I have been more aggressive with trying to bid and buy raw, good-looking Polar Bears to send for grading and then to stash for the next couple of years. We will see if I'm right in this. I never want anyone to make a decision from their wallet based on what I say, but I really think that mid-grade T206 off-back material is going to be very scarce as the next couple of years go by. And now this also brings me to a really good point here for my brand new website around Polar Bears. If you have not visited T206polarbear.com, when you get a few seconds, go ahead and check it out. It's got a searchable checklist. It has my set images. They're not updated with my current purchases or my new graded order from SGC, but I'm going to continue to build this out to be the absolute best resource and home for everything related to T206 Polar Bears. But let's now talk about my true passion, that is T206 Polar Bears. My purchases can be summed up in really 3 ways. Routine, I took a gamble on one, and another one I found an absolute ghost, which I was very, very thankful for in Cleveland. But first up here, I had 2 cards on my want upgrade list headed to the National. One was Jimmy Lavender, the second was Dots Miller. I was able to find both of these in a PSA slab. I will be, of course, resubmitting all of these PSA cards to SGC, looking to make sure they get to that 3 level, and that's my goal for my Polar Bear set. But I was very happy to knock out Dots Miller and Jimmy Lavender from the same dealer. I was also able to find this Harry McIntyre Brooklyn and Chicago card. The good thing with my current McIntyre, it's not an immediate upgrade, but there was a little bit of a corner missing on it, so it was nice to get this one upgraded. And then my last PSA purchase was Patsy Daugherty, well-centered, nice-looking PSA 3 for under $100. Again here, hoping to see an SGC 4 when I get it back here from SGC. Now, joining those 4 cards on their journey to Florida will be this SGC 2 Jack Knight with Bat. This is what I consider a gamble purchase. Take a look at that card. It is perfect in my opinion, and it's a 2. Yes, the bottom left corner is a little rough, and the top left corner maybe has a little bit of an issue as well. But I'm banking on the fact that this was graded really hard back when this was graded about 20 years ago. So maybe I'll get lucky. If not, if it comes back at 2, look, I just kind of wasted money, but I'll sell it. I'll find a 3 in the future. But I thought this was just a great looking 2 that may get a modern day bump. Now, one card I'm not going to have to regrade is this Joe Lake without ball variation. This was, and this is, an SGC 3 already. I'll tell you though, if you're a polar bear fan or wanting to learn more around polar bear, the Joe Lake with ball, that card is a lot scarcer than this card no ball. So when you're taking a look at Joe Lake, always look for the ball in hand first over this one. And now this leaves me with my favorite purchases, my 2 favorite of the week. First one is a card which was my very last purchase of the week. And it's something on the card that I nearly missed when I first took a look at this card. Here is, in an SGC 3, Kid Elberfeld Fielding. I will also say here again, not in polar bear though, but his portrait variation is amazing. I would definitely recommend you adding that to your portrait collection for T206. But the coolest thing about this Elberfeld is this is a wet sheet transfer. When you take a look at the very front left of the card on the border, there is the inverse of the polar bear back running from top to the very bottom. So it was a really, really neat way to kind of end my show. I got the card for $120. And then my last card I'm showing off here is the single highest graded card out there in SGC for Russ Ford. This is an SGC 5. Now this was a very abnormal purchase for me. I'm not going to buy a 4 or I'm not going to buy a 5. My goal is to have that SGC 3 set. But this was the highest graded card and it had never sold before on VCP. So it was kind of like a ghost. It was out there on the population reports, but it had never sold previous. And so when I saw this at a dealer, I decided to go ahead and pick it up, and it was a cool addition to my collection. It did cost me $375. I probably could have used some of that money to find other polar bears, but I thought this was a great card to have for my set, because when you look at Russ Ford's population reports, both on PSA and SGC, this one trends towards the lower population count compared to other players that have a polar bear back T206 card. So all in all, the week, in my opinion, for my polar bear set was a resounding success. I knocked out a few big needed upgrades. I was also able, right before the show started, to upgrade my Frank Chance. If you have not seen that video and that story, definitely go check that out right now. But if you want to learn more about T206 or learn more about the players that have a polar bear back T206 card, hit that like button and also hit that subscribe button.